The evening air in Chicago was thick with tension as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet residential block where the incident unfolded. At approximately 8:17 p.m., a violent altercation erupted between 13-year-old Jason Miller and his next-door neighbor, Marcus Reynolds. The dispute, initially sparked by the persistent thumping of loud music, escalated rapidly into a deadly confrontation. By the time police were summoned, Marcus lay gravely wounded from multiple stab wounds, and Jason was apprehended at the scene. Before we dive into this gripping story, we invite you to subscribe and hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments about your perspective on juvenile justice. Your engagement empowers us to keep bringing you these compelling narratives that challenge our understanding of youth and accountability. Detective Linda Perez was one of the first officers on site. She later recounted the scene with clinical detail. The yard was scattered with signs of a heated struggle, overturned chairs, broken glass, and a pool of blood that traced the trajectory of the victim's final moments. But it was Jason's demeanor that struck her most profoundly. Amidst the chaos, the boy was found seated on the stoop of a nearby house, his phone in hand, scrolling through photographs that captured the violent episode. What unsettled the detective was not merely the content of the images, but Jason's reaction. A sharp, almost derisive laugh punctuated his review of the evidence photos. This laughter, incongruous with the gravity of the situation, suggested a disturbing lack of remorse and emotional detachment, rare for someone so young. The community's response was immediate and visceral. The neighborhood, once a mosaic of quiet streets and familial routines, was now gripped by fear and confusion. Neighbors who had known Jason since he was a toddler struggled to reconcile the image of the boy they thought they knew with the violent figure described by law enforcement. "It's like he wasn't even there," one resident said, her voice trembling. "How could a child laugh at something so terrible?" The shock rippled through the local schools, community centers, and social services, igniting urgent discussions about youth violence and its underlying causes. Detective Perez, aware of the mounting public pressure, initiated a meticulous investigation. The initial phase involved securing the crime scene and gathering physical evidence. But crucially, it also entailed observing and documenting Jason's psychological and behavioral responses. The laughter at the evidence photos was cataloged as a significant behavioral marker, a window into the juvenile defendant's state of mind during and after the incident. From the outset, police reports detailed Jason's contradictory comportment. Witnesses described a boy who oscillated between moments of aggressive defiance and unsettling calmness. One neighbor recounted, "He was yelling at Marcus just minutes before the stabbing, cursing, threatening, but afterward, when the police arrived, he seemed almost amused, like it was some kind of game." The striking contrast between the severity of the crime and Jason's apparent indifference presented a complex psychological puzzle for investigators. As the forensic team processed the scene, they uncovered multiple objects of evidentiary value. The knife used in the stabbing was recovered from the vicinity, its blade still stained with blood. Photographic evidence captured from various angles showed the trajectory of the attack, the victim's defensive postures, and Jason's movements throughout the confrontation. These images, later presented in court, would become pivotal in establishing the sequence of events and Jason's role. Detective Perez's early interviews with Jason revealed a defensive posture. Despite the overwhelming physical evidence, Jason initially denied any involvement. His statements were inconsistent and, at times, evasive. Yet, behind the facade of denial and amusement lay a deeper turmoil, observable in fleeting expressions and moments of silence. His laughter, initially interpreted as callousness, began to be understood by some professionals as a possible coping mechanism, a barrier against the emotional weight of his actions and the looming consequences. Jason's family background further complicated the narrative. Social workers, brought in to provide context, reported a history marked by instability and neglect. His parents' sporadic presence, combined with financial hardship, contributed to an environment where Jason's behavioral issues went largely unaddressed. School records indicated prior disciplinary problems, though none escalated to violence. These factors did not excuse his actions, but offered insight into the developmental and environmental influences shaping his conduct. The incident's impact reverberated through the community, prompting a spectrum of reactions. Some residents called for immediate and severe punitive measures, advocating for a trial as an adult to reflect the seriousness of the crime. Others emphasized the need for rehabilitation and support, highlighting the complexity of addressing juvenile delinquency within the legal system. Amid this debate, Detective Perez remained focused on the facts, piecing together the evidence with clinical precision. In the days following the stabbing, investigators meticulously compiled the photographic evidence. Each image was scrutinized for details that could corroborate or challenge witness accounts. The evidence photos, stark and unyielding, served as a silent testimony to the violence inflicted and the emotional detachment exhibited by the juvenile defendant. These visual records would later confront Jason in the courtroom, challenging his earlier claims and demeanor. Throughout the investigation, law enforcement and social services grappled with the dual realities presented by Jason Miller, a child capable of both cruelty and vulnerability. His laughter at the presentation of evidence photos masked a deeper turmoil, a psychological fracturing that complicated straightforward assessments of guilt and intent. This complexity underscored the difficulties inherent in prosecuting juvenile offenders, where legal standards and developmental psychology intersect. The initial interrogation sessions revealed further layers of Jason's psychological state. When questioned about the photos, he recited fragmented justifications for his behavior, oscillating between defiance and moments of apparent confusion. "I didn't mean to hurt him that bad," he muttered during one session, his voice barely above a whisper. Yet, when confronted with the images, his laughter would resurface, a defense mechanism shielding him from confronting the full reality of his actions. Detective Perez observed these interactions with a measured detachment, aware that Jason's courtroom demeanor would become a focal point for both prosecution and defense. The juvenile defendant's early composure, marked by laughter and bravado, set the stage for a trial characterized by stark contrasts between youthful impetuosity and the harshness of legal accountability. The photographs that Jason mocked were more than mere images. They were artifacts of a tragedy that rippled beyond the immediate parties involved. They captured not only the physical violence, but also the emotional dissonance of a young boy caught between childhood and criminal culpability. The evidence photos became a chilling symbol of the case's complexity, embodying the tension between innocence lost and justice sought. Detective Perez's investigation was methodical. She coordinated with forensic experts to ensure that every aspect of the crime scene was documented and preserved. The knife was sent for ballistic and DNA analysis, confirming Jason's contact with the weapon. Blood spatter patterns were analyzed, linking the wounds to specific angles consistent with witness reports. Surveillance footage from nearby homes supplemented the narrative, providing a timeline that contradicted Jason's initial statements. Throughout this process, Jason's courtroom demeanor was a subject of keen interest. The juxtaposition of a 13-year-old boy laughing at evidence photos while facing allegations of attempted murder confronted the legal system with unprecedented challenges. How to interpret such behavior as immaturity, defiance, or sociopathic tendencies became a central question for psychologists and legal experts alike. The initial investigation phase closed with a comprehensive dossier submitted to the state's attorney's office. The accumulation of evidence, forensic, photographic, testimonial, painted a detailed portrait of the night's events. Yet, the case's emotional and psychological dimensions remained unresolved, foreshadowing the complexities that would unfold during trial. Detective Linda Perez, reflecting later on the early stages of the investigation, noted the haunting paradox at the heart of the case. Here was a child who should have been protected, yet he caused harm that no child should ever inflict. His laughter at the evidence photos was not just a moment of callousness. It was the first sign of a deeper struggle within him, a struggle between adolescence and accountability, between vulnerability and violence. In the weeks that followed, the community's unease grew. Schools held assemblies addressing violence and conflict resolution. Social workers increased outreach efforts, attempting to engage at-risk youth. Yet, amidst these efforts, the image of Jason laughing at the evidence photos lingered, a stark reminder of the fragility and complexity of juvenile justice. The incident's initial investigation thus set the stage for a case that would probe the limits of legal definitions, psychological understanding, and societal expectations. It was a case that demanded not only forensic rigor, but also a nuanced appreciation of the human psyche, especially when that psyche was still in the fragile process of development. As the night's events receded into the past, the photographs remained silent, unblinking witnesses to a violent act committed by a child on the cusp of adulthood, challenged by forces both within and beyond his control. The laughter that greeted these images was an unsettling prelude to the emotional and legal battles that lay ahead. Detective Linda Perez's return to the crime scene the following morning revealed new facets of a chaotic tableau. The yard where the altercation had taken place remained cordoned off, the air heavy with the remnants of violence and unanswered questions. The disorder spoke volumes: overturned furniture, broken glass reflecting the harsh light of day, and the stark, ominous stains of blood. Each element testified to the intensity of the confrontation between Jason Miller and Marcus Reynolds. Yet it was the stark contrast between the physical evidence and Jason's initial calm, even mocking demeanor that weighed heavily on the investigative team. The forensic team meticulously documented the scene. Blood spatter analysis indicated multiple stab wounds inflicted in rapid succession, suggesting a frenzied attack rather than a single defensive strike. The positioning of the victim's body, partially collapsed against the fence, spoke to a desperate attempt to retreat that was ultimately futile. The recovered knife, still stained and bearing traces of the victim's blood, was carefully bagged and sent for further analysis. Forensic evidence would later confirm that the blood on Jason's clothing matched Marcus's, directly linking the juvenile defendant to the weapon and the assault. Within this grim physical context, Jason's behavioral profile became a focal point of the investigation. Detective Perez compiled reports from witnesses who had observed the incident unfold. Their testimonies painted a picture of escalating aggression. One neighbor, who had been watching from her porch, described Jason's demeanor as hostile and confrontational, noting that he shouted threats and appeared visibly agitated before the stabbing. Another recounted hearing a heated exchange that quickly spiraled into violence. It wasn't just an argument, it was like he was looking for a fight. The stark contrast between Jason's aggressive behavior preceding the stabbing and his subsequent calmness perplexed investigators. His earlier laughter at reviewing evidence photos hinted at a psychological detachment, unusual for someone so young. This dichotomy prompted further scrutiny of Jason's background, seeking to understand the environmental and developmental factors that might explain such behavior. A comprehensive review of Jason's personal history revealed a troubled home environment marked by instability and neglect. Social services records indicated frequent absences by his parents, who struggled with substance abuse and economic hardship. Jason's upbringing was characterized by inconsistent supervision and a lack of positive role models. Educational records from his middle school documented repeated behavioral issues, including defiance, truancy, and minor infractions, though notably, there was no prior indication of violent tendencies. Psychological assessments highlighted signs of emotional distress and possible trauma, consistent with the instability in his home life. These findings suggested that Jason's actions might be rooted in deeper psychological and social challenges, complicating the simplistic narrative of juvenile delinquency. The investigation acknowledged that while these factors did not excuse the violent act, they were critical for understanding the juvenile defendant's mental state and capacity for decision-making at the time of the crime. The forensic evidence collected at the scene provided an irrefutable link between Jason and the stabbing. Blood samples taken from the knife and Jason's clothing matched the victim's DNA, establishing direct contact. Fingerprints on the weapon corresponded with Jason's, further cementing his involvement. Additionally, trace evidence such as fibers and skin cells corroborated the physical struggle described by witnesses. Witness interviews also revealed a pattern of escalating hostility between Jason and Marcus prior to the incident. Neighbors recounted prior disputes over noise complaints and territorial disagreements. This history of tension suggested that the stabbing did not occur in isolation, but was the culmination of ongoing conflict. These details would later inform the prosecution's argument that the attack was not entirely impulsive, but born of accumulated animosity. Throughout the investigation, Jason's courtroom demeanor remained a subject of intense observation. His early defiance and laughter at reviewing evidence photos sharply contrasted with moments of silence and withdrawal during interviews. Law enforcement officers noted these fluctuations as indicative of a complex psychological profile. Some experts posited that his laughter functioned as a defense mechanism, a way to mask fear, shame, or confusion in the face of overwhelming circumstances. The juxtaposition of Jason's calmness amidst physical evidence of violence presented a challenging scenario for the investigative team. Detective Perez and her colleagues approached the case with clinical objectivity, aware that the juvenile defendant's behavior would be scrutinized by legal and psychological experts alike. Their detailed reports, combining forensic analyses with behavioral observations, laid the groundwork for the forthcoming legal proceedings. The community's reaction to these revelations was one of shock and concern. Parents and school officials expressed frustration over the apparent failure to identify and address Jason's escalating behavioral issues before they culminated in violence. Social workers highlighted the systemic challenges faced by families like Jason's, emphasizing the need for early intervention and mental health support. Public forums debated the adequacy of existing juvenile justice policies in handling such complex cases. As forensic reports were compiled, law enforcement sought to build a comprehensive timeline of the events leading to the stabbing. Surveillance footage from nearby residences captured fragments of the confrontation, corroborating witness accounts of Jason's aggressive posture and movements. Cell phone records placed Jason at the scene during the critical time frame, further dismantling his initial claims of self-defense and denial. Jason's own statements during subsequent police interviews began to shift under the weight of accumulating evidence. Initially defiant, he gradually adopted a more guarded and inconsistent narrative. At times he offered vague justifications for his actions. At others, he remained silent, avoiding direct answers. This behavioral shift hinted at an emerging awareness of the gravity of his situation, contrasting with the earlier laughter observed at the evidence photos. Psychologists consulted during the investigation emphasized the significance of Jason's age in interpreting his behavior. Adolescents often exhibit impulsivity and limited foresight, factors that influence their decision-making and emotional responses. However, the presence of premeditation indicators, such as prior disputes and aggressive online activity, complicated the assessment. The forensic evidence and witness testimonies suggested that the stabbing was not a purely spontaneous act, but involved elements of planning and intent. Detective Perez's detailed documentation of Jason's background and the forensic findings underscored the multifaceted nature of the case. The juvenile defendant was neither a simple victim of circumstance nor a cold-blooded aggressor. Instead, he embodied a complex intersection of developmental, psychological, and social factors that challenged conventional categorizations. The forensic evidence, coupled with Jason's behavioral profile, set the stage for a difficult legal confrontation. The police reports, witness statements, and psychological assessments would later be scrutinized in court, where defense attorneys would argue for leniency based on Jason's age and troubled upbringing, while prosecutors would emphasize the violent nature of the crime and the need for accountability. In the days following the collection of physical and testimonial evidence, Detective Perez worked closely with child psychologists and social workers to create a comprehensive profile of Jason Miller. They highlighted his history of emotional volatility, the impact of familial instability, and the signs of unaddressed trauma. These insights were integral to anticipating the legal strategies that would emerge during the trial. Throughout this phase of the investigation, the stark reality remained. A 13-year-old boy had inflicted multiple stab wounds on a neighbor, an act that defied simple explanations. The forensic evidence left no doubt about Jason's direct involvement, while his psychological profile revealed a young mind grappling with forces beyond his control. Detective Perez, reflecting on the complexities revealed during the crime scene analysis and background investigation, noted, "This was not a case of a momentary lapse in judgment. The evidence showed a trajectory of escalating aggression shaped by a challenging environment and psychological turmoil." Understanding these layers was essential for ensuring that justice would be served in a way that acknowledged both the severity of the act and the vulnerability of the offender. The investigation into Jason's background and the forensic evidence collected at the crime scene thus painted a nuanced picture. It was one that balanced the cold facts of science with the human realities of adolescence, trauma, and societal failure. This balanced understanding would become crucial as the case moved forward into courtroom proceedings, where the juvenile defendant's fate would be decided. The shock waves from the stabbing incident extended far beyond the immediate crime scene, reaching deep into the fabric of the community. Residents grappled with a mixture of fear, disbelief, and grief as the reality of the violence perpetrated by a 13-year-old began to settle in. The neighborhood, once perceived as a relatively safe enclave, suddenly found itself confronting unsettling questions about youth violence and the adequacy of existing social safeguards. Local media outlets swiftly picked up the story, their coverage amplifying the community's anxieties. News reports focused intensely on Jason Miller's unusual reaction to the evidence photos. The juvenile defendant's laughter was repeatedly highlighted in broadcasts and print articles, becoming a defining image of the case. This portrayal sparked widespread debate and polarized public opinion. Some commentators condemned Jason as a symbol of a growing epidemic of youth aggression, while others cautioned against rushing to judgment without considering the underlying causes. The media's framing of Jason's courtroom demeanor, particularly his mocking laughter, served to underscore the perceived callousness of the act. Headlines such as "Child Killer Laughs at Crime Photos" and "Juvenile Defendant's Cold Reaction Sparks Outrage" circulated widely, contributing to a narrative that painted Jason as both dangerous and unrepentant. This narrative shaped public discourse, influencing community attitudes and igniting calls for stricter juvenile sentencing laws. Within this charged atmosphere, community leaders and social service agencies sought to respond with measured concern. School officials convened emergency meetings to address the fears of students and parents, many of whom struggled to understand how a local youth could engage in such violence. Counselors were dispatched to schools to provide support, and assemblies were organized to discuss conflict resolution and the consequences of violence. Yet, these efforts were often overshadowed by the community's demand for accountability. Social workers familiar with Jason's case emphasized the complexity beneath the public outrage. They highlighted his history of behavioral issues and the challenges faced in providing effective intervention. Jason wasn't just a troublemaker. One caseworker explained he was a kid crying out for help in ways that weren't always easy to recognize. The system struggled to reach him before things escalated. This perspective, while less visible in the media, resonated within professional circles concerned with juvenile delinquency and mental health. The media's focus on Jason's digital footprint further complicated the community's perception. Reports revealed that investigators had uncovered online activity where Jason viewed violent videos and searched for information on self-defense and weapon use days before the incident. These details, widely publicized, suggested a level of premeditation that intensified public concern. The digital trail portrayed Jason not merely as a reactive youth, but as one increasingly fascinated with aggression, a portrayal that fueled debates about the influence of media violence on young minds. Community forums became arenas for heated discussion. Parents expressed fears about the safety of their children and questioned whether local institutions were doing enough to prevent such tragedies. Law enforcement officials faced demands for tougher enforcement and swifter justice. At the same time, advocates for juvenile rights raised concerns about the potential for disproportionate punishment and the importance of rehabilitation. The polarization within the community reflected broader societal tensions regarding juvenile crime. Some residents called for Jason to be tried and sentenced as an adult, arguing that the severity of the stabbing transcended considerations of age. Others advocated for a more compassionate approach, emphasizing the developmental differences between children and adults and the possibility of reform. These divergent views underscored the challenges facing the legal system as it grappled with cases involving violent offenses committed by minors. School administrators, meanwhile, confronted the immediate task of addressing student safety and emotional well-being. In the weeks following the incident, attendance dropped at local schools, and educators reported heightened anxiety among students. Counselors noted that many children struggled with fear of violence and confusion over the incident's implications. Programs focusing on anger management and conflict resolution were expanded, but the community's wounds ran deep. The media spotlight on Jason's unusual reactions also extended into social media platforms, where public opinion was often unfiltered and raw. Online forums and comment sections brimmed with vitriol, sympathy, and speculation. Some users expressed outrage at Jason's laughter at the evidence photos, interpreting it as a manifestation of sociopathy. Others debated whether the media's portrayal was fair or sensationalized. This digital discourse mirrored the broader societal struggle to understand and respond to juvenile violence. Social workers and mental health professionals voiced concerns about the potential damage of public vilification. They warned that portraying Jason solely as a remorseless aggressor risked obscuring the systemic failures that contributed to his trajectory. We need to balance holding youth accountable with recognizing their capacity for change, one psychologist noted. Demonizing them without addressing the roots only perpetuates cycles of violence. Amid the cacophony of opinions, the victim's family emerged as a poignant presence in the community's conversation. Their grief and trauma added a deeply human dimension to the unfolding tragedy. Public statements by Marcus Reynolds' relatives highlighted the lasting physical and emotional scars left by the attack, reinforcing the urgency of accountability and justice. Their voices often called for a judicial process that would acknowledge both the severity of the crime and the need for healing. Law enforcement officials, including Detective Perez, found themselves navigating the complex intersections of public sentiment, media scrutiny, and investigative rigor. While committed to a thorough and impartial inquiry, they were acutely aware of the case's broader social implications. The investigation's findings, particularly the photographic evidence and Jason's behavior, became focal points for community discussions about youth violence and prevention strategies. The media's emphasis on the photographic evidence introduced a chilling visual element to the public's understanding of the crime. These images, stark and unyielding, captured not only the physical violence but also the juvenile defendant's unsettling responses. The photographs became both evidentiary tools in the legal process and symbols of the case's emotional weight. Their circulation in news reports intensified the community's engagement while raising ethical questions about the exposure of such graphic material. Within this environment, local advocacy groups mobilized to address the underlying issues highlighted by the case. Organizations dedicated to youth development, mental health, and criminal justice reform increased outreach efforts. They organized panels, workshops, and public forums aimed at fostering dialogue and promoting policies that balanced accountability with rehabilitation. These efforts sought to transform the community's shock and fear into constructive action. The media also spotlighted the challenges faced by schools and social services in identifying and addressing behavioral problems before they escalate. Jason's history of disciplinary issues and the apparent failure to intervene effectively became a case study in systemic shortcomings. Educators and social workers engaged in critical self-examination, aiming to improve communication, support networks, and early intervention programs. Despite these initiatives, the community's anguish remained palpable. Residents expressed ongoing unease about the safety of their neighborhoods and the well-being of their children. The case served as a grim reminder of the fragile line between childhood and criminality and the profound consequences when that line is crossed. Throughout this period, Jason Miller remained a figure of intense scrutiny and conflicting perceptions. The juvenile defendant's laughter at the evidence photos was repeatedly cited as emblematic of his emotional detachment, feeding narratives of coldness and defiance. Yet, professionals working closely with Jason cautioned that such behavior might mask deeper psychological distress, a complexity often lost in public discourse. As media coverage persisted, the community's response evolved from shock toward a tentative engagement with broader questions of juvenile justice. The case sparked conversations about the adequacy of existing laws, the role of mental health services, and the societal responsibilities toward at-risk youth. These dialogues, while fraught with tension, signaled a collective grappling with the multifaceted nature of youth violence. Detective Perez observed the community's response with a mixture of concern and resolve. She recognized that while the investigation sought to establish facts and accountability, the case's implications extended far beyond the courtroom. The public's reaction underscored the need for systemic approaches that addressed prevention, intervention, and rehabilitation alongside legal consequences. The interplay between media coverage, community sentiment, and institutional response illustrated the challenges inherent in managing juvenile crime in a complex social landscape. Jason's case became a catalyst for reflection, debate, and potentially change, an emblem of the urgent need to understand and address the root causes of youth violence. In the months following the incident, the community's dialogue continued to unfold. Forums were held, policies reviewed, and new programs initiated. Yet, the shadow cast by Jason's laughter at the evidence photos lingered, a haunting reminder of the emotional and psychological fissures exposed by this tragic event. The media's portrayal, the community's fear, and the social workers' concerns converged to form a narrative that was at once painful and instructive. It revealed the complexities of responding to juvenile violence, a task that demanded not only justice, but empathy, understanding, and a commitment to breaking cycles of harm. This period of community reaction and media coverage thus framed the ongoing investigation and impending trial within a broader societal context. It highlighted the urgent need to balance accountability with compassion and to confront the systemic challenges that underpin such tragedies. The case of Jason Miller was no longer solely about one violent act. It had become a mirror reflecting the struggles and hopes of a community seeking to heal and protect its youth. As the investigation into Jason Miller's stabbing of his neighbor deepened, the forensic team turned its focus toward his digital footprint, a trove of data that would prove crucial in understanding the context and potential premeditation behind the violent act. Law enforcement officials, in collaboration with cybercrime specialists, meticulously examined Jason's online activity in the days leading up to the incident, uncovering a disturbing pattern that challenged the narrative of a spontaneous outburst. The digital forensic analysis revealed that Jason had accessed numerous violent videos, including some that depicted self-defense tactics and the use of knives as weapons. These searches were not random. They demonstrated a sustained interest in aggression and combat techniques. Investigators noted that the timing of these online explorations, occurring within 48 hours before the stabbing, suggested a degree of preparation rather than impulsive action. Further scrutiny of social media activity added layers to this emerging portrait. Messages exchanged with peers revealed escalating tensions with neighbors, particularly Marcus Reynolds, the victim. Texts and posts contained veiled threats and expressions of frustration over ongoing disputes related to noise and territory. In some exchanges, Jason appeared to boast about his readiness to confront those who provoked him, employing language that indicated a growing fascination with violence and dominance. This digital trail raised significant concerns among investigators about Jason's mindset and intentions. The evidence suggested that the stabbing was not an isolated incident born purely of immediate anger, but rather the culmination of a series of provocations and a deliberate, if youthful, contemplation of violent options. This insight shifted the framing of the case, introducing elements of premeditation that would weigh heavily in subsequent legal proceedings. During interviews, when confronted with his online activity, Jason's responses were evasive and inconsistent. At times, he downplayed the significance of his searches, claiming curiosity or boredom. At others, he acknowledged the content, but denied any intent to act on what he had seen. This vacillation reflected a complex psychological state, marked by both defiance and a nascent awareness of the consequences he faced. Cybercrime analysts emphasized that the digital footprint provided an unprecedented window into Jason's thought processes. Unlike traditional evidence, which often reveals only the physical aftermath of a crime, online activity offered a temporal map of his evolving mindset. The progression from passive viewing to active engagement with violent content underscored a trajectory that blurred the lines between influence and intent. The intersection of adolescent development and digital exposure was a critical focus for experts reviewing the case. Psychologists pointed out that young teenagers are particularly susceptible to the effects of media violence, with underdeveloped impulse control and a still maturing prefrontal cortex. In Jason's case, this neurological immaturity may have amplified the impact of the violent content he consumed, contributing to distorted perceptions of conflict resolution and self-defense. Social workers and mental health professionals involved in the investigation highlighted the broader societal implications of such digital exposure. They noted that Jason's case exemplified the challenges faced by families and institutions in monitoring and guiding youth in an age where access to graphic and potentially harmful content is virtually unrestricted. The evidence raised urgent questions about the responsibilities of guardianship, education, and community intervention. Meanwhile, the forensic team integrated the digital findings with physical evidence to construct a comprehensive timeline of events. The online searches and social media messages established a context of mounting hostility and intention that corresponded with witness accounts of escalating disputes. This synthesis of data provided prosecutors with a robust framework to argue that Jason's actions were not merely reactive, but involved a degree of planning and forethought. Legal analysts observed that the presence of premeditation indicators complicated the defense's position, while age and emotional immaturity remained significant factors. The digital evidence suggested an awareness and contemplation of violence that could undermine arguments centered on impulsivity. The prosecution's strategy increasingly relied on this material to depict Jason as a juvenile defendant capable of understanding the consequences of his actions. The defense team, however, contested the interpretation of the digital footprint. They argued that a teenager's engagement with violent media is not uncommon and does not necessarily translate into criminal intent. They emphasized the importance of contextualizing Jason's behavior within his developmental stage and psychological vulnerabilities. Expert witnesses were prepared to testify about adolescent brain development, impulse control deficits, and the role of environmental stressors in shaping behavior. During pretrial motions, debates emerged over the admissibility and weight of the digital evidence. The defense questioned the methods used to retrieve and interpret the data, while prosecutors underscored its relevance in establishing mens rea, the mental state of intent. The court ultimately permitted the inclusion of the digital footprint as part of the evidentiary record, recognizing its probative value in illuminating the circumstances surrounding the crime. Throughout this period, Jason's courtroom demeanor remained a subject of keen observation. The juvenile defendant's earlier laughter at the presentation of evidence photos was contrasted with his quieter, more withdrawn behavior during discussions of his online activity. Some observers interpreted this shift as a sign of growing comprehension, while others noted it as a manifestation of internal conflict and fear. Psychological experts involved in the case provided nuanced assessments of Jason's responses to the digital evidence. They highlighted the potential for such material to reinforce maladaptive thought patterns in vulnerable youth, particularly those experiencing familial instability and social isolation, as in Jason's background. The interplay between environmental factors and digital influence underscored the complexity of addressing juvenile delinquency in the modern era. The examination of Jason's digital footprint also prompted broader conversations within law enforcement and child welfare agencies about the need for enhanced monitoring and early intervention strategies. The case illustrated how technology can serve as both a tool for understanding behavior and a medium through which harmful ideations can be cultivated. This duality emphasized the necessity of multidisciplinary approaches in preventing youth violence. As the investigation progressed, the digital evidence became a focal point for both sides of the courtroom battle. Prosecutors presented the data to demonstrate that Jason's actions were preceded by a conscious engagement with violent content and a pattern of escalating hostility. Defense attorneys sought to mitigate its impact by contextualizing the behavior within adolescent developmental norms and emphasizing the potential for rehabilitation. The forensic photography, digital records, and behavioral analyses collectively painted a complex and troubling picture. Jason Miller was no longer simply the boy who laughed at evidence photos. He was a youth whose digital interactions revealed a deeper engagement with violence and aggression. This multifaceted evidence challenged the legal system to grapple with questions of culpability, intent, and the appropriate balance between punishment and rehabilitation. Detective Perez, reflecting on the significance of the digital findings, remarked, "In today's world, understanding a juvenile defendant means looking beyond the physical crime scene. The digital landscape offers critical insights into their mindset, influences, and potential for change." Jason's case exemplified how these factors converge, complicating our approach to justice. The integration of digital forensic analysis into the investigation marked a turning point. It broadened the scope of evidence beyond traditional parameters, allowing for a more comprehensive understanding of the juvenile defendant's psychological and behavioral profile. This evolution in investigative technique would have lasting implications for the trial and the broader discourse on juvenile justice in an increasingly digital age. The progression of the investigation took a decisive turn as law enforcement confronted a growing array of evidence that dismantled Jason Miller's initial account. At first, the juvenile defendant maintained a narrative of self-defense, asserting that the stabbing had occurred in the heat of an unprovoked attack by his neighbor, Marcus Reynolds. However, as forensic analyses, digital records, and witness testimonies accumulated, this story began to unravel under rigorous scrutiny. One of the most significant developments involved the examination of GPS data extracted from Jason's cell phone. This geolocation information placed him squarely at the scene of the stabbing throughout the duration of the incident, countering his claims of having left the area prior to the confrontation. The precision of the GPS tracking allowed investigators to reconstruct a timeline that aligned closely with surveillance footage obtained from nearby residences. Surveillance video emerged as a pivotal piece of evidence. Cameras positioned on adjacent homes captured fragments of the altercation, revealing Jason's movements in stark contrast to his earlier statements. The footage showed Jason approaching Marcus in an aggressive manner, contradicting the notion of purely defensive action. These visual records corroborated witness accounts of an escalating verbal dispute that culminated in physical violence. Forensic examination of the bloodstains further undermined Jason's version of events. The pattern and distribution of blood spatter on his clothing and the surrounding environment indicated multiple stab wounds inflicted with deliberate force rather than a single reactive thrust. Blood spatter analysis experts testified that these patterns were inconsistent with defensive wounds or accidental contact, instead suggesting a sustained assault. Cell phone records also played a critical role in discrediting Jason's alibi. Call logs and text message timestamps placed him in direct communication with a peer just minutes before the stabbing, during which they discussed the ongoing conflict with Marcus. These communications revealed a tone of agitation and determination, hinting at a readiness to engage in confrontation rather than avoidance. Under mounting pressure from the accumulating evidence, Jason's demeanor shifted noticeably during subsequent interrogations. The earlier bravado and mocking laughter gave way to silence, then to fragmented admissions. At one point, he muttered, "I didn't mean for it to go that far," a phrase that betrayed a dawning recognition of the incident's gravity. This emotional shift was noted by Detective Linda Perez, who observed the juvenile defendant's changing comportment as indicative of internal conflict. Psychologists involved in the investigation interpreted this behavioral evolution as a movement from denial toward a tentative acceptance of responsibility. They emphasized that such transitions are common in adolescent offenders. When confronted with incontrovertible evidence, the complex interplay of defense mechanisms, emotional regulation, and cognitive development shaped Jason's responses throughout the process. Witnesses who had initially provided statements of aggression and hostility were re-interviewed to clarify details and reinforce the prosecution's case. Several neighbors described hearing Jason issue threats and provocations in the hours leading up to the stabbing, painting a picture of escalating tension rather than spontaneous reaction. These testimonies contributed to the characterization of the juvenile defendant's actions as premeditated. The forensic team's comprehensive approach integrated physical evidence, digital data, and testimonial accounts into a cohesive narrative. This multidimensional reconstruction of events allowed prosecutors to challenge Jason's claims systematically, highlighting inconsistencies and contradictions. The evidence photos, previously mocked by the juvenile defendant, now stood as silent witnesses to the reality of the assault. The contrast between Jason's earlier courtroom demeanor, marked by defiant laughter, and his later emotional withdrawal, underscored the psychological toll of the legal process. Defense attorneys noted the strain on their young client, arguing that his initial reactions stemmed from immaturity and a lack of understanding of the consequences. They contended that the evolving admissions reflected a growing awareness rather than guilt. During interrogations, Jason's shifting narrative was punctuated by moments of confusion and silence. At times, he appeared overwhelmed by the weight of the evidence presented against him. His statements vacillated between minimization and partial acknowledgement, reflecting the cognitive dissonance experienced by many adolescents facing serious charges. These psychological dimensions became a subject of expert testimony in preparation for trial. Detective Perez emphasized the importance of maintaining a balanced approach during questioning. She noted, while it was crucial to hold Jason accountable, We also recognized his youth and vulnerability. Our goal was to uncover the truth with sensitivity, ensuring that his rights were respected even as we pursued justice for the victim. The dismantling of Jason's alibi and the corroboration of evidence from multiple sources marked a turning point in the case. The accumulating data painted a picture that conflicted sharply with the juvenile defendant's initial portrayal of events. This shift heightened the stakes of the forthcoming trial, where these contradictions would be rigorously examined. Legal experts observed that such unraveling of a defendant's narrative is not uncommon in juvenile cases, where emotional immaturity and impulsivity can lead to inconsistent accounts. The challenge for the court would be to weigh these factors against the compelling physical and digital evidence, balancing considerations of intent, capacity, and culpability. As the investigation concluded its evidentiary phase, prosecutors prepared to present a case emphasizing the deliberate nature of the assault. The integration of forensic science, digital data, and eyewitness testimony provided a robust foundation. The photographic evidence, once a source of Jason's mocking laughter, now served as an unassailable record of his actions. Throughout this period, Jason's courtroom demeanor continued to evolve. The initial defiance gave way to moments of visible distress, culminating in an emotional breakdown during pretrial hearings. This transformation revealed the profound psychological impact of confronting the consequences of his behavior. Observers noted that these shifts would play a significant role in shaping perceptions during the trial. The case thus transitioned from investigation to prosecution, marked by a clear delineation between Jason's early denials and the weight of corroborative evidence. The unraveling of his alibi and contradictory statements underscored the complexities inherent in adjudicating juvenile crime, where developmental factors intersect with legal standards. Detective Perez reflected on the investigative process with a somber recognition of its challenges. Uncovering the truth required painstaking attention to detail and patience. Jason's changing accounts and behavior mirrored the struggle between youthful denial and accountability. Our responsibility was to present the evidence clearly and fairly, ensuring that justice served both the victim and the juvenile defendant. As the scene was set for trial, the evidence against Jason appeared incontrovertible. The GPS data, surveillance footage, forensic analyses, and witness testimonies converged to form a narrative that left little room for doubt. Yet, beneath this factual clarity lay the unresolved tensions of youth, trauma, and the pursuit of justice that would define the case's next chapter. The transition from investigation to prosecution marked a critical juncture in the case of Jason Miller. With an extensive evidentiary dossier assembled, the state's attorney's office prepared to bring the 13-year-old juvenile defendant to trial, an undertaking fraught with legal, psychological, and ethical complexities. Central to the prosecution's strategy was the determination to try Jason as an adult, a decision that ignited controversy and underscored the stakes involved. Prosecutors framed their argument around the violent nature of the crime and Jason's apparent lack of remorse. They contended that the stabbing was not an impulsive act of teenage recklessness, but a deliberate and dangerous assault, exacerbated by the juvenile defendant's troubling behavior both before and after the incident. The photographic evidence, digital footprints, and forensic data formed a compelling narrative of premeditation and accountability. Chief Prosecutor Marcus Ellis articulated the state's position with clinical precision during pre-trial conferences. "This was a violent attack that left a man seriously wounded," he stated. The defendant's initial laughter at reviewing evidence photos reflects a disturbing detachment from the gravity of his actions. "We believe that, despite his age, Jason Miller must be held to adult standards to protect the community and uphold justice." The decision to pursue adult charges was not taken lightly. Prosecutors acknowledged Jason's youth and the developmental considerations inherent in juvenile justice. However, they argued that the severity of the stabbing, combined with the evidence of premeditation and the defendant's behavioral history, warranted an adult trial. This stance aligned with recent legal precedents allowing for such transfers in cases involving serious violent offenses committed by minors. Defense attorneys, led by Public Defender Sarah Kim, mounted a vigorous response, emphasizing Jason's age and emotional immaturity. They underscored the importance of rehabilitation over punishment, advocating for the juvenile justice system's capacity to provide treatment and support tailored to adolescent development. Kim highlighted Jason's troubled upbringing and the absence of prior violent behavior, framing the stabbing as a tragic outgrowth of environmental pressures rather than inherent malice. "Jason is a child," she argued. "His brain is still developing, his capacity for impulse control limited. He needs intervention, not incarceration alongside adults. Our focus must be on his potential for rehabilitation, not solely on retribution." Psychological experts were enlisted by the defense to evaluate Jason's mental state and capacity for understanding the consequences of his actions. Dr. Emily Carter, a clinical psychologist specializing in adolescent development, testified extensively during pretrial hearings. She detailed the neurological immaturity typical of 13-year-olds, particularly in areas governing impulse control, judgment, and emotional regulation. Dr. Carter explained that while Jason exhibited troubling behaviors, these were consistent with developmental vulnerabilities, compounded by his unstable home environment. She cautioned against equating his actions with adult criminality, without considering the potential for growth and change inherent in youth. Punitive measures must be balanced with the recognition that the adolescent brain is malleable, she stated. Rehabilitation offers the best avenue for reducing recidivism and promoting long-term societal safety. Prosecutors countered with testimony from forensic experts and criminologists who emphasized the violent nature of the offense and the need for accountability commensurate with the harm caused. They argued that Jason's actions exceeded typical adolescent misconduct, crossing into territory demanding adult-level consequences. Legal debates during pre-trial motions centered on the appropriateness of transferring Jason to adult court. The defense raised constitutional concerns regarding juvenile rights and the potential psychological harm of adult incarceration. Prosecutors cited statutory provisions and prior rulings supporting their position. Ultimately, the court ruled in favor of adult trial jurisdiction, setting a precedent that would reverberate beyond the case itself. As trial preparations advanced, both sides focused on constructing narratives that would resonate with jurors. The prosecution sought to portray Jason as a dangerous youth who consciously chose violence, while the defense aimed to elicit empathy for a troubled child in need of guidance and treatment. The photographic evidence, once the source of Jason's mocking laughter, was poised to play a central role in the courtroom. Prosecutors intended to use these stark images to illustrate the severity of the assault and the defendant's emotional detachment. Defense counsel planned to challenge the interpretation of Jason's reactions, arguing that they reflected psychological defense mechanisms and immaturity rather than cold-heartedness. In parallel, social workers and mental health professionals prepared to present contextual background on Jason's family dynamics and behavioral history. This testimony aimed to humanize the juvenile defendant and underscore the systemic failures that contributed to his trajectory. The defense hoped this would sway the court toward leniency and rehabilitation-focused sentencing. The community remained deeply divided over the impending trial. Victim advocacy groups and residents called for strict punishment, emphasizing public safety and justice for Marcus Reynolds. Conversely, juvenile justice advocates and child psychologists urged caution, warning against the long-term consequences of adult sentencing on adolescent offenders. Throughout this preparatory phase, Jason's own courtroom demeanor fluctuated. Early in the process, his defiant laughter at evidence photos was replaced by moments of silence, anxiety, and occasional emotional breakdowns. Legal observers noted that these shifts reflected the psychological burden of facing adult charges, a weight disproportionate for someone so young. Attorney Kim described her client's evolving state. Jason is confronting realities that no child should have to face. His fear and confusion are palpable, and they highlight the need for a justice system attuned to the unique needs of juvenile defendants. The prosecutorial team, while firm in their position, acknowledged the trial's delicate nature. Prosecutor Ellis remarked, "We are committed to a fair trial that respects Jason's rights while ensuring accountability. The evidence is clear, but the court must also consider the complexities of youth justice." Expert witnesses were scheduled to provide testimony on adolescent brain development, behavioral psychology, and the impact of trauma. These presentations aim to inform the jury about the scientific underpinnings of juvenile behavior and the implications for culpability and sentencing. As opening statements approached, the courtroom atmosphere was charged with anticipation. The case had transcended a simple criminal trial, becoming a focal point for broader societal debates about juvenile justice, the limits of accountability, and the balance between punishment and rehabilitation. Legal scholars observed that the trial would test the evolving standards of juvenile prosecution, challenging the courts to reconcile the demands of justice with emerging understandings of adolescent psychology. The outcome would likely influence future cases involving violent crimes committed by minors. Detective Linda Perez, reflecting on the trial preparations, noted the case's gravity. This isn't just about one boy's actions. It's about how society chooses to respond when children cross the line into violence. The decisions made here will resonate far beyond the courtroom walls. The prosecution and defense each prepared to present their case with vigor, aware that the stakes extended beyond Jason Miller's fate. The trial promised to illuminate the tensions inherent in juvenile justice and the complexities of adjudicating serious crimes committed by the young. As the courtroom doors opened to the public and press, the scene was set for a legal battle that would probe the intersections of law, psychology, and morality. Jason Miller's trial would compel all involved to confront difficult questions about childhood, culpability, and the capacity for change. The courtroom was tense as proceedings commenced, the gravity of the case palpable among all present. Jason Miller, the 13-year-old juvenile defendant, sat with a guarded expression, his earlier defiance tempered by the weight of the moment. The trial unfolded as a meticulous examination of evidence, testimony, and expert analysis, each element contributing to the complex narrative of adolescent violence and accountability. Witnesses were called to recount the events leading up to and during the stabbing. Neighbors testified to the escalating hostility between Jason and Marcus Reynolds. One witness described hearing Jason's raised voice moments before the attack. He was shouting threats, saying he wasn't going to let Marcus get away with it anymore. Another recounted seeing Jason brandish a knife during the confrontation, contradicting claims of self-defense. These testimonies reinforced the prosecution's assertion of aggressiveness and intent. The presentation of digital forensic evidence marked a critical juncture. Cyber experts detailed Jason's online activity, emphasizing his viewing of violent videos and searches related to self-defense and weapon use in the days preceding the incident. The prosecution argued that this digital trail illuminated a calculated mindset, challenging the defense's portrayal of impulsivity. Screenshots and timelines were displayed, illustrating a pattern of escalating interest in aggression. Photographic evidence, stark and unyielding, was introduced to the jury. Images depicting the crime scene, the victim's wounds, and Jason's movements were shown with clinical detachment. The juvenile defendant's earlier laughter at these photos was recalled by Detective Perez during her testimony, underscoring the prosecution's narrative of emotional detachment. The courtroom atmosphere grew heavier as these visual records confronted the jury with the brutal reality of the assault. In response, the defense sought to contextualize Jason's behavior within the framework of adolescent development. Psychologists testified about the neurological immaturity of teenagers, particularly in areas governing impulse control and emotional regulation. Dr. Emily Carter, recalling her pre-trial evaluation, explained, "At 13, Jason's brain was still developing. His ability to foresee consequences and regulate impulses was limited, which must be considered when assessing his actions and intent." The defense also presented evidence of Jason's troubled upbringing. Social workers detailed the instability and neglect in his home life, emphasizing the lack of consistent support and guidance. This testimony aimed to evoke empathy and highlight systemic failures that contributed to Jason's trajectory. Counsel argued that these factors mitigated his culpability and underscored the need for rehabilitation over punitive sentencing. Cross-examinations brought further complexity. Prosecutors challenged the defense experts' conclusions, pointing to the digital evidence and witness testimonies as indicators of premeditation inconsistent with mere adolescent impulse. Forensic analysts reiterated the pattern of the stabbing wounds, describing them as deliberate rather than defensive. The battle of narratives unfolded through expert discourse and legal argumentation. Throughout the trial, Jason's courtroom demeanor fluctuated. While he maintained composure during witness testimonies, moments of visible distress emerged when confronted with the photographic evidence and digital records. At times, he appeared withdrawn, his eyes downcast, contrasting sharply with the earlier bravado and laughter observed during the investigation phase. This behavioral shift underscored the psychological toll of the proceedings on the juvenile defendant. The prosecution's closing witness was Detective Linda Perez, whose detailed narrative bridged the investigative and emotional dimensions of the case. She recounted Jason's initial laughter at the evidence photos, describing it as a chilling indication of emotional detachment. Her testimony linked the forensic evidence with behavioral observations, reinforcing the argument for adult-level accountability. The defense's closing expert summarized the scientific understanding of adolescent brain development, reiterating the potential for change and rehabilitation. She cautioned against equating youthful impulsivity with adult criminal intent, urging the jury to consider Jason's age and psychological profile in their deliberations. Public interest in the trial was intense, with media coverage highlighting the conflicting perspectives on juvenile justice. Commentators debated the implications of the evidence presented, reflecting broader societal tensions regarding accountability, rehabilitation, and the treatment of young offenders. As the trial progressed, jurors grappled with the dual realities presented: a violent act with significant physical and emotional consequences, and a young defendant whose developmental stage complicated traditional notions of culpability. The case demanded a nuanced consideration of law, psychology, and ethics. The courtroom proceedings illuminated the challenges of adjudicating juvenile crime in cases of serious violence. The interplay of forensic evidence, witness accounts, and expert testimony created a multifaceted narrative that resisted simplistic conclusions. Jason Miller's case thus became a focal point for examining the boundaries of juvenile justice. The defense's emphasis on rehabilitation and developmental science sought to temper the harshness of adult sentencing. Conversely, the prosecution's focus on premeditation and the severity of the harm underscored the demand for accountability and public safety. This dialectic framed the trial's core conflict. Throughout testimony, the contrast between Jason's initial courtroom laughter at the evidence photos and his later emotional responses was a recurring theme. It highlighted the psychological complexities of adolescent offenders facing adult charges, where moments of defiance may mask underlying fear and confusion. The trial also raised questions about the role of photographic and digital evidence in shaping juror perceptions. The starkness of the images and the immediacy of digital records brought an unflinching clarity to the proceedings, challenging jurors to reconcile emotional reactions with legal standards. As closing arguments approached, both sides prepared to encapsulate their narratives. The prosecution would stress the evidence of intent and the need for a sentence reflecting the gravity of the offense. The defense would appeal to compassion, emphasizing youth, potential for reform, and the dangers of adult incarceration. The impending jury deliberation promised to be a crucible for these competing perspectives. The verdict would not only determine Jason Miller's fate, but also resonate within broader debates on juvenile justice policy and practice. Detective Perez, reflecting on the trial, remarked, "This case forces us to confront difficult truths about childhood, responsibility, and the justice system. It is a testament to the complexity of human behavior and the challenge of balancing justice with mercy." As the courtroom prepared to hear final statements, the tension was palpable. The trial of Jason Miller stood as a somber reminder of the fragile intersection between youth and the law, the consequences of violence, and the enduring quest for a just response. The courtroom settled into a heavy silence as closing arguments commenced, the culmination of a trial fraught with emotional weight and legal complexity. Both prosecution and defense rose to deliver their final appeals, seeking to sway the jury in a case that epitomized the tensions inherent in juvenile justice and violent crime. Prosecutor Marcus Ellis approached the podium with measured gravitas. His voice was steady, underscoring the severity of the offense and the evidence presented. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case is about accountability for a violent act that forever changed a life. The defendant, despite his youth, committed a deliberate and brutal stabbing. The evidence is clear. The photographs you have seen, the digital footprints revealing premeditation, the witness testimonies confirming aggression, all point to a conscious choice to inflict harm." Ellis emphasized Jason Miller's initial courtroom demeanor, recalling the unsettling laughter the juvenile defendant exhibited upon viewing the evidence photos. "Such a reaction is not that of remorse, but of detachment," the prosecutor asserted. "It speaks to a dangerous disregard for human life. We ask you to hold Jason Miller responsible as an adult, to recognize the gravity of his actions and the need to protect our community." Turning to the elements of premeditation, Ellis outlined the digital evidence uncovered during the investigation. The defendant's online activity demonstrates a troubling fascination with violence and weaponry in the days leading up to this crime. This was not a spur-of-the-moment act. It was the culmination of escalating hostility and preparation. Justice demands that such a calculated act be met with appropriate consequences. Ellis concluded by appealing to the jury's sense of duty. While youth may be a mitigating factor in some cases, it cannot excuse the deliberate infliction of serious harm. The law recognizes that some crimes transcend age, and this is one such case. We urge you to deliver a verdict that affirms justice and deters future violence. The courtroom atmosphere shifted as defense attorney Sarah Kim rose for her closing. Her tone was earnest, seeking to humanize Jason and contextualize his actions within the framework of adolescent development and environmental hardship. "Members of the jury," she began, "we are here to consider not just what happened on that tragic night, but who Jason Miller is as a young person. He is not a hardened criminal. He is a child shaped by neglect, instability, and emotional turmoil." Kim acknowledged the severity of the stabbing, but cautioned against equating youthful impulsivity with adult culpability. "Science tells us that Jason's brain, like that of all teenagers, is still developing. His capacity for impulse control and foresight was limited. His actions, while tragic, were not the product of cold calculation, but of a young mind struggling to cope." She drew attention to the psychological evaluations presented during trial, highlighting Dr. Emily Carter's testimony. "Experts agree that Jason's emotional responses, including his unsettling laughter, may have been defense mechanisms, ways to shield himself from overwhelming guilt and fear. These are not signs of callousness, but of a child in crisis." Kim also emphasized Jason's potential for rehabilitation, underscoring the role of the juvenile justice system in offering treatment and support tailored to his developmental needs. Punishing Jason as an adult could doom him to a lifetime behind bars, exacerbating the very issues that led to this tragedy. We have the opportunity to guide him toward recovery and reintegration. Appealing to the jury's compassion, Kim concluded, "I ask you to consider Jason's age, his background, and his capacity for change. Justice is not served solely by punishment, it is served by understanding and the chance for redemption. Following these impassioned appeals, the jury retired to deliberate. The weight of their task was evident as they grappled with the stark evidence of violence and the complex questions of juvenile culpability and sentencing. Hours stretched, punctuated by moments of quiet reflection and intense discussion. Jurors debated the significance of Jason's age against the premeditated nature of the crime. Some expressed sympathy for the defendant's troubled upbringing, while others focused on the need for accountability and public safety. The deliberations were marked by careful consideration of the photographic and digital evidence, which painted an unflinching portrait of the assault and the defendant's mental state. The jury wrestled with the dichotomy between Jason's initial laughter and his later emotional breakdown, interpreting these behaviors within the context of adolescent psychology. Ultimately, the jury reached a verdict that reflected the complexity of the case. Jason Miller was found guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. More consequentially, the jury agreed that his case warranted trial and sentencing as an adult, a decision that ignited immediate controversy within the courtroom and the community. The verdict underscored the jury's recognition of the violent and deliberate nature of the offense, despite the defendant's youth. It also highlighted the evolving legal standards that permit the adult prosecution of juveniles in cases involving serious violent crimes. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of reactions. Victim advocates expressed relief and a sense of justice served, while juvenile rights proponents decried the decision as harsh and potentially damaging to a young life. The judge called for order, preparing to address the next phase of the legal process. Defense counsel indicated plans to file appeals, challenging the adult trial designation on constitutional and developmental grounds. They reiterated concerns about the psychological impact of adult incarceration on a 13-year-old and the broader implications for juvenile justice reform. Prosecutors defended the verdict as a necessary affirmation of the law and community safety, emphasizing the need to hold violent offenders accountable regardless of age. They pointed to the evidence of premeditation and the seriousness of the injury inflicted as justification for the adult trial ruling. The community, already divided over the case, found the verdict further polarizing. Public forums and media commentary reflected deep disagreements on how society should balance accountability and rehabilitation for juvenile offenders. The Jason Miller case became emblematic of these broader debates, challenging policymakers and citizens alike. Legal experts weighed in, noting that the verdict set a significant precedent in the jurisdiction's approach to juvenile violent crime. The decision would likely influence future cases and prompt renewed examination of laws governing the transfer of minors to adult court. Psychologists and child advocates voiced concerns about the long-term consequences of adult sentencing for adolescents. They warned of increased risks of recidivism, psychological harm, and diminished prospects for rehabilitation when juveniles are confined in adult facilities. As the courtroom emptied, the gravity of the verdict settled over all involved. Jason Miller, though found guilty, remained a child confronting the full force of the adult criminal justice system. His journey from laughter at evidence photos to a guilty verdict and adult prosecution embodied the tragic complexities of juvenile crime and punishment. Detective Linda Perez reflected on the outcome with a mixture of solemnity and resolve. The case challenged us to look beyond simple categories of guilt and innocence, she said. It forced us to confront the difficult realities of youth violence and the limits of our legal system. Now, the focus must shift to ensuring that justice is balanced with the possibility of rehabilitation. The verdict marked a turning point, not an end. The forthcoming sentencing phase and appeals would continue to shape the narrative as Jason Miller's case remained a touchstone for ongoing discussions about juvenile justice, accountability, and the capacity for change in young offenders. The courtroom was heavy with solemnity as the sentencing phase commenced, the culmination of a trial that had stretched the boundaries of juvenile justice and societal expectations. Jason Miller, now stripped of the defiant composure that once masked his turmoil, sat silently as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict that would determine the trajectory of his young life. Throughout the proceedings, the emotional undercurrents were palpable. Victim impact statements formed a poignant fabric of testimony, weaving together the physical and psychological trauma inflicted by the stabbing. Marcus Reynolds' family spoke with measured grief, their words conveying the lasting scars beyond the immediate wounds. "Our lives have been changed forever," his sister declared, voice trembling yet resolute. "The pain, the fear, it doesn't end with the hospital stay, it follows us every day." These statements underscored the profound human cost of the violent encounter, emphasizing the necessity of a sentence that acknowledged the severity of the harm caused. The courtroom absorbed the gravity of these accounts, the collective weight of loss and trauma pressing upon all present. As the judge took the bench, the atmosphere shifted to one of intense focus. The legal parameters surrounding the sentencing of a juvenile tried as an adult were complex, reflecting evolving standards and ongoing debates within the criminal justice system. The judge began by reviewing the facts established during the trial, reaffirming the jury's findings of guilt and the decision to impose adult charges. The court recognizes the defendant's youth and the mitigating factors presented, the judge stated, voice steady yet somber. However, the nature of the offense, violent, deliberate, and causing significant harm, compels this court to impose a sentence consistent with adult adjudication. Jason's courtroom demeanor transformed in that moment. The earlier stoicism gave way to visible distress, his eyes welling with tears that betrayed the emotional weight he had so far contained. The defense attorney reached to offer a quiet word of comfort, but the juvenile defendant's breakdown was unmistakable, a stark contrast to the laughter that once greeted evidence photos during the investigation. The judge proceeded to impose a sentence of 20 years in an adult correctional facility, with eligibility for parole after 10 years. This decision reflected the court's balancing act between acknowledging Jason's potential for rehabilitation and addressing the seriousness of the crime and its impact on the victim and community. Legal analysts noted the sentence's significance as both punitive and cautiously tempered by parole eligibility, a nod to the defendant's youth and the possibility of future reform. The judge's remarks emphasized the importance of protecting society while recognizing the unique challenges presented by juvenile offenders in adult systems. The emotional aftermath of the sentencing rippled beyond the courtroom walls. Jason's breakdown elicited complex reactions. Some saw it as a moment of genuine remorse. Others questioned whether it stemmed from fear of incarceration or the crushing reality of adult sentencing. Psychologists involved in the case suggested it was likely a mixture of both, reflecting the profound psychological impact of facing long-term imprisonment at such a young age. Victim advocates expressed cautious satisfaction, emphasizing that justice had been served, but acknowledging the difficulties inherent in punishing youthful offenders severely. The sentence sends a clear message about the consequences of violent crime, one advocate noted, but it also reminds us of the need for comprehensive support systems to prevent such tragedies. The community's response remained divided. Some residents applauded the judge's firmness, viewing the sentence as necessary for public safety and accountability. Others decried the harshness of adult sentencing for a child, advocating for greater emphasis on rehabilitation and mental health services. These debates echoed broader societal tensions regarding juvenile justice policies. Within correctional and mental health circles, concerns were raised about the implications of incarcerating Jason in an adult facility. Experts warned of increased risks of physical harm, psychological deterioration, and diminished prospects for rehabilitation when juveniles are housed with adult inmates. These issues underscored ongoing calls for reform and specialized juvenile programs. The sentencing also sparked discussions about the efficacy and ethics of long-term incarceration for adolescents. Critics argued that such measures may entrench criminal behavior rather than foster rehabilitation, while proponents insisted that public safety and justice for victims must remain paramount. Throughout these dialogues, Jason Miller's case became emblematic of the complex challenges facing the juvenile justice system. His journey, from a 13-year-old who laughed at evidence photos to a young man sentenced as an adult, highlighted the fragile line between childhood and criminal liability. Detective Linda Perez reflected on the sentencing with a measured sense of gravity. The court's decision acknowledges the severity of the crime, but it also raises difficult questions about how we treat young offenders. Jason's story is a stark reminder of the need for a justice system that balances accountability with compassion and the potential for change. As Jason was led from the courtroom, the emotional weight of the moment lingered. The path ahead was uncertain, marked by the harsh realities of adult incarceration and the faint hope of eventual parole. The sentencing phase brought into sharp relief the human cost of violent crime and the profound complexities involved in adjudicating juvenile offenders. The legal and societal conversations ignited by this case continued unabated, prompting renewed examination of policies regarding the prosecution and sentencing of minors. Advocates for reform called for enhanced mental health support, early intervention programs, and alternatives to adult incarceration that recognize the developmental needs of youth. Jason's case thus stood at the crossroads of legal precedent and social conscience, a tragic narrative underscoring the imperative to reconcile justice with humanity. The courtroom's somber verdict marked not an end, but a critical point in an ongoing dialogue about how society addresses the intersection of youth, violence, and accountability. As the community grappled with the aftermath, the echoes of that day, the laughter at evidence photos, the stabbing, the courtroom tears, served as a stark reminder of the fragile boundaries between childhood innocence and the consequences of violent actions. The story of Jason Miller compelled all to confront these difficult realities, challenging the justice system and society to seek paths that protect, punish, and ultimately heal. Jason Miller's case transcended the confines of the courtroom, reverberating through the legal system, the community, and the broader discourse on juvenile justice. The sentencing of a 13-year-old to an adult facility ignited a multifaceted debate, exposing societal tensions and challenging established norms regarding the treatment of young offenders. At the heart of the controversy lay fundamental questions about the appropriateness of adult sentencing for minors. Legal scholars and practitioners grappled with the precedent set by Jason's trial and sentence, scrutinizing the criteria used to transfer juveniles to adult court. The case highlighted the delicate balance between protecting public safety and recognizing the developmental differences that distinguish adolescents from adults. Advocacy groups intensified their calls for reform, emphasizing the need for a justice system that prioritizes rehabilitation and mental health support over punitive measures. They argued that incarcerating youths like Jason in adult facilities exacerbates psychological harm and diminishes prospects for successful reintegration. These voices underscored the importance of early intervention programs and community-based alternatives tailored to at-risk youth. Psychologists specializing in adolescent development weighed in, reiterating that the teenage brain's ongoing maturation affects impulse control, risk assessment, and susceptibility to environmental influences. They cautioned that adult sentencing often fails to account for these factors, potentially undermining efforts to reduce recidivism and promote positive outcomes. Community leaders, educators, and social workers confronted the systemic challenges illuminated by the case. They acknowledged the gaps in mental health services, family support, and school-based interventions that, if addressed, might prevent similar tragedies. The case sparked discussions on allocating resources toward comprehensive support networks and enhancing collaboration between agencies tasked with youth welfare. Simultaneously, victim advocacy groups emphasized the necessity of accountability and justice for those harmed. They advocated for sentencing policies that reflect the severity of violent offenses while balancing considerations of age and rehabilitation potential. Their perspectives highlighted the complexity of crafting policies sensitive to both victims' rights and juvenile offenders' developmental needs. Policymakers and legislators took note, initiating reviews of juvenile justice statutes and sentencing guidelines. Jason Miller's case became a catalyst for legislative proposals aimed at refining criteria for adult court transfers, expanding diversion programs, and investing in mental health and social services. These efforts reflected a growing recognition of the need for a nuanced approach to juvenile crime. The media continued to cover the aftermath extensively, framing the case as emblematic of broader societal struggles with youth violence and justice. Public opinion remained divided, reflecting competing values of punishment, public safety, compassion, and hope for rehabilitation. Within correctional systems, the case prompted reevaluations of housing policies for juvenile offenders sentenced as adults. Concerns about safety, psychological well-being, and access to age-appropriate programming spurred calls for specialized units and enhanced protective measures. The challenges faced by juveniles in adult facilities became a focal point for reform advocates. Educational institutions integrated lessons from the case into curricula and training programs, emphasizing conflict resolution, emotional regulation, and early identification of behavioral issues. Schools sought to strengthen partnerships with mental health providers and community organizations to better support vulnerable students. Social workers involved in Jason's assessment and support highlighted the importance of a multidisciplinary approach to juvenile justice. They advocated for integrated services that address the complex interplay of psychological, familial, and societal factors influencing youth behavior. Their experiences underscored the necessity of proactive engagement before crises occur. The case also influenced professional discourse within psychology and criminal justice fields. Conferences and publications examined the implications of adolescent brain science for legal responsibility, sentencing, and rehabilitation. Jason Miller's story became a reference point in debates about how to reconcile scientific understanding with legal frameworks. As debates unfolded, the ethical dimensions of trying juveniles as adults came to the fore. Questions about proportionality, fairness, and the potential for lifelong consequences shaped discussions among ethicists, legal experts, and community stakeholders. The case illuminated the moral complexities inherent in balancing justice with mercy. For Jason Miller himself, the legal and societal debates represented a world from which he was largely isolated. His journey through the adult correctional system would be shaped not only by the sentence imposed, but by the evolving landscape of juvenile justice reform and community attitudes. His case remained a poignant reminder of the human faces behind legal precedents and policy discussions. Detective Linda Perez reflected on the broader impact of the case. Jason's story forced us all to confront uncomfortable truths about how we treat our youth, especially those who falter. It challenged us to rethink justice, responsibility, and the support structures needed to prevent such tragedies. The hope is that from this difficult case, we learn and build a more compassionate, effective system. The community continued to wrestle with the aftermath, seeking ways to heal and prevent recurrence. Forums, workshops, and collaborative initiatives emerged, aiming to address the root causes of juvenile violence and foster resilience among at-risk youth. Jason Miller's case became a catalyst for ongoing efforts to create safer, more supportive environments. In the legal arena, the case spurred scholarship and reform aimed at harmonizing juvenile justice with contemporary psychological insights. Legislators and practitioners grappled with designing systems that honor both the need for accountability and the promise of rehabilitation, reflecting evolving societal values. Ultimately, the case of Jason Miller underscored the profound complexities at the nexus of adolescence, crime, and justice. It illuminated the challenges of adjudicating youth who commit serious offenses, the consequences of adult sentencing, and the urgent need for systemic approaches that balance protection, punishment, and the capacity for change. As society continues to evolve in its understanding of juvenile offenders, Jason Miller's story remains a somber touchstone, a narrative that compels reflection, reform, and a recommitment to justice that is both firm and compassionate.